Hello and welcome to another episode of Creative Intelligence. I'm your host Kartik Hosanagar, and in this podcast we'll explore many themes related to AI, creativity, and maximizing human potential. Most of us recognize that AI is going to have a big impact on work. The question is, what are we supposed to do about it? Meaning, how can we take charge and feel like we're in control in terms of how AI shapes our own work? Now, one of the things that I commonly encountered on the internet when it comes to this question is the statement that AI will not take your job, but someone using AI will. This statement seems to imply that the solution to staying in control of how AI impacts our work is to simply embrace AI and adopt more AI. So many of us have started using AI tools and started to become more AI forward or more efficient and progressive users of AI. But the question is whether that alone is enough. I actually think there's a few different issues there. The first is that the statement assumes that the only impact that AI will have is augmentation and not displacement. And I think that's incorrect. There are going to be instances where AI will in fact displace workers. And so simply adopting AI is not going to be enough. But the other piece is also that this statement assumes the only impact of AI is going to be in terms of either displacement or augmentation, and there's nothing else. And I think that's a fallacy as well. The idea that AI can either displace or augment, and therefore we should embrace AI and ensure that it augments, ignores that AI can have a broader set of changes. And that is what I want to explore in this episode today. Specifically, I want to explore how AI is going to impact work and the broader system of work. To explore this, I've invited Sangeet Paul Choudary. Sangeet is an author and thought leader who has written a lot about how digital technologies impact work and more recently how AI impacts work. He's the author of the book Platform Revolution, and more recently he's written a book called Reshuffle, which explores how AI impacts work. The book comes out soon, and I'm excited to explore some of its ideas in this episode. Sangeet, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kartik. It's a pleasure being here.
So Sangeet, you wrote an article specifically about this statement, AI won't take your jobs, but people using AI will. And you said in your article that this kind of statement is seductive precisely because it seems very empowering. But you also went on to say that ultimately you believe this statement is a framing error. So help us understand why you think the statement is a framing error.
Yeah, Kartik, the reason I call it a framing error, and I'll take an example or a story over here which has nothing to do with AI, but it illustrates what we're talking about. So, following the First World War, during the 1930s, France was building what was called the Maginot Line. It was a set of defenses and fortresses to prevent Germany from attacking. And what eventually happened in 1939 when the Second World War broke out was that the Maginot Line, this impenetrable defense, did exactly what it was supposed to do. It kept the German forces out, but the German forces attacked France without going through the Maginot Line, by going through the swampy forest on the other side, which France had never expected them to go through. And the reason they were able to do that was because of technology. The rise of two-way radio communication had created a new form of coordination in warfare that did not exist in the past. So now German fighter pilots and tanks and foot infantry, all of them could coordinate much better using two-way radio communication, and they were able to, because of that, create this new system of warfare called blitzkrieg, where you could just get all these forces work together and hit at the same time. France was working with the traditional frame that it was going to work on the basis of trench warfare, what had happened in World War I. And so the Maginot Line was a perfect defense for an older system, but the system had changed. So my point is that when we look at AI today and we say AI won't take your job, but someone using AI will, we are assuming that the system won't change. We are assuming that AI's impact is only on the tasks, and that AI can actually either replace tasks or improve tasks. It's not going to change the larger system around it. But just like radio communication changed the system of warfare and created a new way to coordinate warfare, AI today changes the system of work, not just your jobs, but the organizations, the workflows, and even the larger competitive ecosystem within which the whole logic of your firm makes sense. And so that's the key idea. If we don't look at the system of work, we're caught in that framing error similar to the Maginot Line.
Got it. Help us understand what you mean by a system of work changing. Like, what's an example of how systems of work change in a manner that looking at tasks would not help us understand that?
Yeah, so when I think of the system of work, I'm really thinking about jobs sit inside organizations, and the tasks within jobs sit inside workflows. So they are interdependencies. Their jobs do not exist in isolation. And even though we think of a job as, meaning something, project manager versus doctor, these jobs emerged out of the requirements of a system. And when AI changes the larger system of work, the jobs that sit within it also start changing in response, because jobs are essentially bundles of tasks which are trying to achieve a certain goal within that system of work. So when I think of a system of work, it's jobs sitting within organizations and workflows, but even the organization sitting inside a larger competitive ecosystem. And as the rules of competition in the ecosystem change, the organization itself changes what it prioritizes and what will help it compete. And my key point is that before you even think about AI as changing only jobs, AI is actually changing the competitiveness at the level of the ecosystem as well. And that's really what we should be looking at in terms of the overall system of work.
Okay, what's an example of a system of work changing because of which maybe certain jobs become irrelevant? Doesn't have to be AI, because AI is relatively new in terms of us seeing its impact. But digitization, platforms, and things like that, where are examples of technology is changing systems of work because of which, maybe perhaps a job or a bundle of tasks became completely irrelevant?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and I'm going to take an example which is quite far from, digital, and this is the example with which I opened the book. This is the example of container shipping. So before container shipping, docks used to work with big bulk cargo, and dock workers would move cargo up and down and would essentially their jobs were built around the ability to move cargo around. What happened is that once the shipping container came in, the first order effect of the shipping container was that ports could now be automated, because you had standardized packets in which you could lift cargo up to and from a ship. But the far more important second order effect was that once the shipping container was standardized across ships, across railways, and across trucks, you now had the first intermodal transport mechanism, because of which the cost of freight dramatically collapsed. When the cost of freight collapsed, and this is the second order effect, you now started having the possibility to unbundle manufacturing. Manufacturing did not have to happen all co-located, all within the same facility. You could now unbundle it across the globe, and global supply chains came into being. And once global supply chains came into effect, the logic of competition changed, because now competition was no longer at the level of the product, but at the level of the component, because components could be manufactured anywhere in the world, and they could be shipped, and the cost of shipping was no longer, and more importantly, the uncertainty related to shipping had been taken away. And so what ended up happening was that entire industries like computing would not have happened if manufacturing had not been unbundled, because before the shipping container, mainframe computing was very vertically integrated. And with the rise of global supply chains, computing became increasingly unbundled and allowed faster cycles of innovation at the level of the microprocessor. So my point is that if you were a dock worker, you would just be thinking about, is my job going to go away because of port automation? But what was more important was that entire ports became irrelevant when the system of trade changed. And so it's the same thing that happens when AI has an impact at every level of the system of work. We have to think about those second and third order effects.
Got it. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. So the analogy here that I hear you mention is the dock worker who's maybe worried about automation through cranes and things like that, is perhaps missing the broader change that's happening because of containerization, which ultimately changes which organizations work with which organizations, what is actually sourced and what is not, which ports are relevant, which ones aren't. And the displacement is happening because a port becomes irrelevant as opposed to the crane taking over this worker's job. Am I framing this correctly based on what I heard?
Absolutely. Ports becoming irrelevant. You have, middlemen becoming irrelevant because they were there to minimize uncertainty. And now that shipping did not have that uncertainty, a lot of middlemen got out of, got removed as well. So absolutely, that's the whole idea.
Okay. And how do, as an individual worker or a manager, think about how is the system around me changing and how that will have downstream implications for me? Because I understand what you're saying in terms of don't think about the task level, think about the system changes. But what's a way to approach that, approach the understanding the changes at the system of work level?
Yeah, so it's to think about an initial framework of how to think about the impact of a changing system of work or the impact of AI on your job, right? Think of any activity that you do, any task that you are performing as having three forms of value. One is the intrinsic value of a task. So something might be valuable just because it creates value. The second is the economic value of a task, which is the amount that you will be paid in an open market or in any kind of market setting for that particular task. So there are tasks that have intrinsic value but do not have economic value. If you're using an Uber and the Uber driver smiles at you, he's not being paid for that by the algorithm. He's only being paid for moving from point A to point B. So the movement from point A to point B has economic value, but the Uber driver's smile does not have direct economic value. We can go deeper into that, but my point is that intrinsic value and economic value are different. And the third piece that's important is that tasks also have contextual value. A task may be highly valuable in a certain context, but when the context changes, the task might become much less valuable. So the first thing to think about is to really think about your job in terms of both economic value and contextual value. What are the parts of your job because of which you are commanding a premium today, either because it is difficult to acquire that skill or because there are just very few people who can perform that particular task. Then think about how the economic value first changes because of AI. And at that level, you can think of the task becoming easier with AI, more people can do it as a result, and so on. But then also think about the contextual value. Is the organization changing because of AI? For example, is customer support suddenly becoming fully automated? And does that change how you, in a complementary role within the organization, get impacted because of it? So my point is think about all of these three things simultaneously. Don't hinge all of your focus on the intrinsic value of your task, as it were, because the whole point that, as humans, we will always have an edge is built on the idea of intrinsic value. Yes, as humans, we perform a lot of work that has very high intrinsic value that machines can't perform. But in order to be compensated for it and in order for those tasks to be relevant, they also need to have high economic value and high contextual value.
One of the ideas that you bring up in your book is also that AI can change something that was previously a specialized skill, where specialists perform certain tasks, and convert it into a generalist skill because it makes it possible for lots of lay people to perform tasks. We're starting to see that with things like coding, where previously coding was done by specialized coders, but today with natural language instructions, I can get a website made, an app made, similarly in design and a number of areas. And so you brought up how the shift from something that is a very specialized skill to something that's a generalist skill can also impact whether that kind of job function exists. So I'd love to hear more about that idea and specifically how that relates to what you just mentioned about these three different types of value as well.
Yeah, a really good example is the impact that word processors or the arrival of word processors had on the job of typists. So if you think about the job of typists was structured around one single constraint, and that was that editing documents was very expensive. If you had to edit documents, you needed collaboration across different teams because there were central pools of typists who had to work with these different teams, and even the actual task of editing it before the word processor was expensive. So all of that needed special training, and all of that demanded a special role. When word processors came out, there was the equivalent of typists or word processors won't take your job, but people using word processors will, just like we have with AI today. But actually what happened was very different, because word processors changed the system of work by removing that constraint. The cost of editing was no longer high. The cost of editing went down, and editing was continuous inside a word processor. And what happened as a result was that typing in itself was not the valuable skill. The expensive editing was the valuable skill around the constraint. And so when that constraint was removed, typing became a part of everybody else's workflow. So it was not typists using word processors who removed typists not using word processors. It was a changed system of work where typing was redistributed across the entire workflow, so that it no longer needed a special separate skill. And that was the key idea of the job disappearing when the system of work itself completely changes. The first impact that happens because of it is that the economic value of that task goes down, because the economic value is basically what the market will pay. And so if the supply associated with that task of performing that task suddenly dramatically increases, the economic value of the task goes down. And we've seen that in some, to a large extent with previous technologies. When the chainsaw came, it replaced the axe wielders who trained over years in the art of how to fell down trees. But with the chainsaw, it allowed many more new people to do that. And more recently, GPS-based navigation allowed Uber drivers and so on. And this commoditization, or this downplay in economic value, gets accelerated when your task becomes commoditized to such an extent that it can be managed by an algorithm. And that's what happens with an Uber driver or a delivery rider. So there's an important distinction to be made of, even with commoditization, are you part of a system where you can actually be algorithmically or more your work can be managed on the basis of a limited set of variables, versus you are in a system where your work is distinct enough. So the first aspect of commoditization is the economic value goes down. The second aspect, as you said, with vibe coding and all, if everybody can code, you need to look at what is the new constraint. In the past, coding itself could have been a constraint because getting to that was difficult. But now that everybody can code, validating that code, using that code as part of a larger system where it aligns with the larger logic of that software system, those things become more important. So when a certain skill becomes commoditized and widely available, the constraint will always shift. And you will have to identify what the new constraint is and move to that, and that is where the contextual value is high. So contextual value is always linked to where the new constraint in the new system sits.
Right. Yeah, one way I think about that constraint in terms of my own job is, if I'm a professor and I'm teaching students, historically the value was knowledge transfer. There's knowledge, expertise one has acquired, and you're transferring that. Over time, you look at the internet, now you look at AI, that expertise is accessible now to students who, any topic, anytime, they can go in and get the information they want. And like I said, it was already there with Google, but now further accelerated with ChatGPT. And so now I think about the constraint is not so much the knowledge transfer, because that knowledge is accessible, but maybe the constraint still is things like motivation, things like inspiration. So then I kind of feel like a lot of my emphasis has to now shift towards making sure I convey why something is important, why you should be excited to learn it, and get that emotional reaction and response from the student and inspire them. And the knowledge transfer now becomes something that I do jointly with AI versus I do alone. And sounds like what you're describing is something similar, which is just think about what part of your job, what tasks became easier or less scarce, and what parts are continuing to be constrained today.
Absolutely right. And if I take that example, and just extend it a little further to add some related color. If we think of AI as a technology that has made answers more accessible, that has made knowledge more accessible, the constraint on the student side, or even on your side as the teacher, is always to ask, what are the questions that matter now that answers are easily accessible? And the reason that is important is because when answers are easily accessible, you can go into all kinds of inquiry paths which might seem reasonable and correct, but may not be. And so asking the right questions becomes way more important, because when answers become cheap, the opportunity cost of going down the wrong path is actually the most expensive thing. And so having the right framing of inquiry becomes really important. And this, directly plays into what people say, that consulting is dead. I don't believe consulting is dead, and it's not because humans will buy from humans. It's more because consulting or problem solving has always been about identifying the right path of inquiry. And in the past, you could have shoddy consulting done because some slides looked beautiful and so answers looked seemingly correct. But now, in order to differentiate, you will have to ask the right questions. And asking the right questions is also compounding, because if you're following the wrong path of inquiry, you might end up with very beautiful slides, but you'll very soon see that it's not yielding results. But the right path of inquiry with cheap answers alongside it is actually compounding. So the right consultants will actually create higher leverage now, I believe.
Sangeet, when you say the system of work changes, and also you bring up this point that certain specialized skills become more generalist skills with AI, the thing I'm thinking about is that this impact is not even within an organization across functions, across jobs. There are going to be certain kinds of tasks and job functions that are impacted more and certain ones that are less. Even using your analogy of constraints, there are going to be certain jobs where constraints get removed by AI in big ways, and some others where the constraints shift more towards those jobs or those functions. And so I'm kind of thinking that the end result of this is that, the power dynamics change in organizations. Certain roles become more or less important. Walk us through that process of how that is likely to pay out and why that happens, and where exactly does the power shifts to?
Yeah, the power dynamics are absolutely changing because of whenever the system of work changes, power reorients accordingly. And it's not just within organizations, but even outside it in the competitive ecosystem. Within organizations, there are certain effects of AI that are increasingly likely. The first is that different teams within an organization will be impacted to different extents. So there are teams which work on complex subsystems. If you are an electric, if you're an electric vehicle maker, the team that is working on self-driving, for instance, has to work across many different specialities and disciplines, and has to create a complex subsystem, the knowledge of which is not yet available outside the organization, and certainly not in a model. And so teams like this, with proprietary knowledge, will actually benefit, because a lot of their rote work of documenting what they're doing and disseminating it across the organization, a lot of that can be handled with AI much more effectively. On the other hand, teams that were actually entirely doing knowledge management tasks within the organization, which were taking knowledge from one place, synthesizing it, making it usable in other places, a lot of that can now be taken over by AI. So the whole idea of knowledge management, which is required to drive coordination between teams in an organization, that being absorbed with AI as it improves, is one big aspect in terms of impacting all of these internal jobs that existed primarily for that reason. So my primary purpose of contrasting these two teams and types of teams in particular is the nature of the knowledge and how proprietary it is, and the extent to which AI can take over that particular task, even though it's knowledge work, highly specialized, right? The second thing is in terms of how AI changes the scope of your role, because very often when the contextual value of your role changes, it changes because your position in different teams is going down. Teams are reorienting, and the skill that you had, with which you could contribute to a certain team, that particular team may not even exist. So your voting power in the organization goes down, because your voting power essentially comes not from your skills, but from your contribution to various projects and various work streams within the organization. So if the work stream and workflows around you change in a way that your skills are not relevant to them anymore, then your voting power in the organization goes down. Your role gets narrowed, and even if you're not removed immediately, over time parts of your role might be bundled with somebody else's role. On the other hand, if the system is changing in a way that you are becoming more central, then your voting power in organizations goes up. You start getting onto a higher speed career path. So these changes have always happened because teams have changed, organizations have changed around changing environments. But with AI and with other converging factors, those changes may happen much, much faster. And the final point I'll just make is that what used to happen within the organization versus what happens outside it, the boundaries of the organization will change as well, because it's not just foundational models being available with the world's knowledge, trained on the world's knowledge. Organizations can train their own models and make them available externally, so that people externally, experts who did not have the organizational context but had some deep expertise on a certain proprietary topic, they can work with the organizational context alongside the organization. So today, a lot of outsourcing or external freelancing that happens around an organization is based on tasks that can be easily managed and easily removed without losing context when moved outside the organization. But now that the organizational context can also move as a model, the nature of work that can move outside will change as well. So it's all these three things that will change power in terms of where it sits.
So let's try and think through that with an example. The example I'll pick for the sake of this discussion is, let's say, the IT function in an organization. Historically, the IT function is the one everyone goes to when they want to implement anything in code. And so the engineering team prioritizes the various requests coming in from different functions, and then proceeds to go implement that. One of the areas where AI is already having pretty significant impact is in coding itself. We're seeing this in a few different ways. Engineering teams are becoming more productive through tools like Cursor and others. But also we have tools like Lovable and Replit and others that are vibe coding tools, where somebody with almost zero engineering experience can start to use these tools and build apps and things like that. So when you have that kind of an impact that AI is having on the engineering function, including for non-engineering teams, how would that shift the power dynamics based on what you just outlined as the different ways in which AI impacts power structures?
So I think one of the ways to think about it is that, and this goes a little further away from the specific question but looks at the larger system, is to really think about the nature of software itself. Software has been built in a very packaged form where this is how the software works, and as a user you cannot really edit it, you cannot really change it. One of the ways to think about the accessibility to easy code generation would be to create new software interfaces where every individual user could modify the functionality that they're working with within certain limitations. And this is what's important, because anything that makes the entire software system breaks down, which is actually where the constraint sits, those should not be available to the vibe coders, but anything that can be customized by them so that they can better use it to solve their problems should be available through an interface where they can do that customization. In general, whether the IT function in an organization or product development more generally, this changes the paradigm of how we build software products as well, because today the way we do it is we spend a lot of time understanding customer problems, and then we try to build something that fits as big a market as possible. Whereas in the future, the last mile of making the software work for me could be done through a combination of I can code this software, through a combination of there's a better AI help that is helping me onboard on a software that's not so easy to onboard on. So in general, what an IT function used to do, create the right software for you, help you troubleshoot, help you onboard onto a software. All of those things can be impacted by AI using these two paradigms, the ability to change within certain limits what you're working with, and the ability to be helped by AI as a co-worker on onboarding onto that particular software and troubleshooting it.
Sangeet, one last question I have focuses less on the system of work and the changes within the system of work, because I think we've fleshed it out well and I understand your perspective. But I want to talk a little bit about how firms themselves change. And you've brought up the fact that the firms themselves may not be stable, and it's a fallacy to think so. So walk us through that thinking a little bit.
So the idea of AI changing the nature of the firm, it comes from two issues. It's essentially this, that the organization itself sits inside a competitive ecosystem. And when the rules of competition in the ecosystem change, as they do with AI, and I'll share a few examples of how they do, then the nature of the organization, or the basis of what the organization has to accomplish, also changes in response. So when we think of AI as a tool to replace certain tasks within it, we assume that the organization is stable and there are certain tasks that are going to be taken up by AI, certain tasks which used to be done by humans. It's a very traditional model that has come from how we've looked at previous eras of mechanization, where the impact actually used to happen on tasks without fundamentally changing the nature of competition in the competitive ecosystem. But when the nature of competition in the competitive ecosystem changes, everything changes in response. I'll give a very quick example to show how that works with one simple and easy to understand example, and then talk about the kinds of tensions that emerge. So the reason this mechanization logic of tasks changing inside a stable firm is not correct is, if you just think of Amazon warehouses and the workers in the Amazon warehouse, you might think that with the mechanization logic, the Kiva robots that keep moving around the warehouse are just warehouse automation. So they are just robots that are taking on some tasks and workers are taking on some other tasks. But really, you need to understand both the workers and the Kiva robots in light of Amazon's larger system of work and competitive ecosystem. And all of them exist to solve one problem: two-day delivery for Amazon. Two-day delivery, and what yields that two-day delivery most effectively, or what yields the fulfillment solution most effectively, constantly changes based on the data that Amazon captures, which then changes how its warehousing network is structured, where it's positioning which kinds of packets, and eventually it changes the distribution of tasks between the warehouse workers and the robots. The reason I'm taking this example is that it's an extreme example because it's highly commoditized work, fully managed by algorithms as such. But the main point that I want to make is that jobs and machine-human relationships exist within a larger system of work. And when the larger system of work and the competitive logic of that changes, all of those things under it are up for change. And so the organization itself is not stable because there are multiple competitive tensions happening in the ecosystem. I'll just give a few to kind of illustrate this. The first is that once AI models and AI capabilities become more widely available, you now have the ability to produce output that used to require significant capital investment, significant labor, hiring, etc. You have the ability to do that with much smaller teams, which means that entrepreneurial organizations, single-person firms, really small teams, which use this commoditized capabilities and bundle others. Special skills that they have alongside it, can now compete with large organizations. So the nature of competition changes because size is no longer necessarily the right basis of competition. It's more the ability to use AI and other forms of modular redeployable assets to keep changing as the nature of competition is changing around you. So these firms are going to be much more nimble and are going to change much more easily in response to changing environment, and are able to compete much better with the larger firms. So that's one example. The second example of competitive tensions that come up is simply, what happens when AI essentially changes the customer journey. Because today there are multiple points in the customer journey where jobs exist just to assist the customer. This could be a customer support agent, it could be a reseller, it could be a store worker, it could be somebody who comes in and troubleshoots your problem. And in industries and in customer journeys where AI can take over assisting the customer so that those problems don't even arise, where AI can help answer customer uncertainties or address customer uncertainty at various points in the journey so that you don't even need a human to come in. You now start seeing a shift in power between those who own the end customer relationship, like a reseller or a system integrator or a store worker, versus those who own the model, which is helping the customers solve their problems much more effectively. And a third competitive tension I'll just mention is that unlike previous tools, if you were a carpentry shop and you were buying a hammer, you never felt the hammer manufacturer was competing with you. But today, if you're a consulting firm or a legal firm or even a pharmaceutical company, and if you're using third-party AI and you're not using significant proprietary knowledge and building significant value on top of it, you are training an industry-wide utility that's constantly learning from you, and that enables, for the first time, tool providers to go deep into a solution provider's business, and that creates new kinds of competitive tensions. So these are various reasons because of which the larger ecosystem around a firm is changing, and so the idea of a stable firm does not really make sense when the basis of why that firm existed changes.
I want to circle back to where we started. We started with the statement, AI won't take your job, someone using AI will. And we talked about how that statement is seductive because it's empowering. And I think you've shown us the various ways in which there are framing errors in that statement. And while I appreciate those framing errors, I think many of us now feel less empowered because it feels like, that's perhaps a wrong framing for how to approach AI. But the question is, how should people approach AI? Given everything that you've described, Sangeet, what are one or two practical tips you would share with our listeners in terms of how they can feel more in control of how AI impacts their work?
Yeah, when I think about these issues, even though I'm writing a book about this, I'm constantly thinking about how this applies to my work, how it applies to how I want to think about my work as well. And I think there are two or three things that are significantly important, and that is to focus less on saying humans will always matter, because that's the intrinsic value versus economic value confusion that happens. Yes, humans will always matter, but we care about where's the economic value and contextual value of the work that we are doing. So the first thing that I would look at is think about what are the constraints in the larger system of work, in whatever problem you're trying to solve. What are those constraints, and how can you move towards owning those constraints or resolving those constraints? And the second important thing is that when execution gets commoditized, the way it is happening right now, value is no longer in execution, but value is in taking the risk associated with the choice. It's in knowing what to execute. It's in, if you can whip up answers very quickly, it's knowing which answer you can stand with in front of a client and back it up because you have the judgment and the insight on why that answer is the correct answer, and you have the ability to back it up when somebody goes 3 or 4 layers deeper. So my key point is that eventually contextual value comes from the ability to spot constraints and to take risks associated with anything breaking down in the system. And today's compensation actually, whether we agree with it or not, kind of shows that to some extent, where CEOs are compensated quite heavily, but that is because in an uncertain and changing world, they are constantly taking risk about where to invest and where not to invest. And my point is that when execution starts becoming more and more commoditized, it's the ability to take highly specialized judgment and assume the risk associated with it. That's what helps you capture real value. So look for those things in your job, look for where those things fit in. And the final thing I'll say is a lot of complex problems have not been solved in the past because we were too busy executing. If you look at the classic case of radiologists, people used to say radiologists will be out of business because AI can read, interpret images much better. Most radiologists now do more complex work, which is not just about taking, making judgment calls and assuming the risk associated with it, but also sitting on cross-disciplinary teams and really working on identifying real edge cases on why this tumor works a certain way and how can multidisciplinary solutions come after it. So think of recombinant value, because the more digital and AI try to fragment what we do, the more we gain power by recombining things that have not been combined in the past. So these are the three things that I would really focus on.
Excellent. This has been a fascinating conversation. Sangeet, thank you so much for joining Creative Intelligence today.
Thank you, Kartik. My pleasure.
That was an interesting conversation with Sangeet. I took away two interesting ideas from the discussion. The first was Sangeet's point that AI doesn't simply automate or augment individual tasks. It changes entire system of work. And when the architecture of work changes, there are broader implications that might be ignored if you're only looking at the impact of AI at the task level. One example he brought up was containerization technologies. And he brought up how a dock worker who is maybe focused on whether the crane is going to displace the worker is missing the fact that containerization is changing broader shipping, changing supply chain organizations, changing what companies make in-house versus source from outside. And ultimately, all of that changes commerce itself and changes which ports are relevant, which ones are not. And the worker thinking about how the crane impacts their job is missing that the broader architecture of work is changing. And so clearly, if we are merely thinking about, will I be replaced by AI or somebody else using AI, we're missing broadly this theme of what is the broader change in the architecture of work. The other idea that I thought was interesting is also related to this question of how AI could perhaps change certain jobs or skill sets that have previously been specialized into more generalist skills. So for example, Sangeet talked about typists, and when word processors came in, typists were not replaced by somebody else using word processors, meaning another typist using word processors. But instead, what was a specialized skill became a generalist skill, so that all of us picked up typing skills, and ultimately we could type our own agreements, print it out, and so on, and the specialized skill no longer agrees. So the question is, as AI levels the playing field for a lot of specialized job functions, whether it's certain things related to coding or with design and many other such skills, are certain specialized skills going to become generalist skills? And when that happens, it isn't that the skill is no longer relevant. What is happening is that the specialized job function no longer exists, and many of us pick up those skills. And that's another way in which work changes because of AI. These were some interesting themes we explored. The question is, what is one to do about it? Sangeet shared 2-3 different ideas. My personal take on it is, what are we supposed to do about it is not yet obvious to most of us today. I think the important thing to take away from today's episode is to recognize that while it makes sense for all of us to adopt AI, it should not lull us into complacency, because augmentation is going to be an important part of how we adapt to the future needs of the workplace. But there's going to be much else going on as well, including the architecture of work or the system of work changing itself. I think one way I approach it is to ask, what are the new constraints? We talked about that a little bit in today's episodes. So I talked about how with my own job, I think about, okay, the constraint is less the knowledge transfer, but it's maybe around the inspiration or the curation or things like that. And so I'm focused a little more on those pieces. And so really thinking about, within a job or job function, what are the different sets of activities? What was scarce but now has become abundant because of AI? And what continues to be scarce? And shifting our focus towards those scarce skill sets or assets or needs within the organization. So these were some interesting ideas that came up today. I hope you found it interesting. And of course, we'll continue to explore a number of these things in the coming episodes. Thanks again for joining Creative Intelligence. Please join the conversation. You can share your comments on this platform and I'll personally review them. And if you have suggestions on future guests, please share those as well, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode. Thanks again for joining. This was Creative Intelligence, and I'm your host, Kartik Hosanagar.